He demanded she take a tougher line against communism. Eventually, Aquino fired Enrile after discovering he planned a coup against her government. She reshuffled her cabinet and negotiated a ceasefire with the communist rebels. Aquino also won $200 million in aid from the United States, and more than 3 times that amount from Japan. So, in 1 year, Aquino led a peaceful revolution, quieted the communists, and resisted a coup attempt. But she has yet to deal with the biggest problem she inherited from Marcos, an economy in shambles. For the Year in Review, I'm Christiane Amanpour.
In South Africa, it was a year of discontent. Amid the unrest and the outrage, strict emergency powers became firmly entrenched.
Fueled by the injustices of the apartheid system, rage burned in the black townships of South Africa. The violence took many forms: bombings, beatings, even burials. Then fighting broke out between rival black groups in the Crossroads squatter camp. The government clamped down with a vengeance and declared a nationwide state of emergency. At least 8,000 people were arrested under the strict emergency regulations, many of them leaders of the opposition. But the unrest did not end. Only news of it did. The media were forbidden from reporting on the violence.
The new security laws have accomplished what they set out to achieve. We simply don't know what's going on inside Soweto, and even if we did, we couldn't tell you.
Bishop Desmond Tutu defied the government by calling for stronger international sanctions.
Well, I just want to know what the world is waiting for.
The world didn't wait much longer. The Commonwealth voted to impose sanctions against South Africa. Congress did too, over the strong objections of President Reagan.
We and our allies cannot dictate to the government of a sovereign nation, nor should we try.
President Reagan vetoed the bill only to be overridden. Universities, cities, and states across America followed suit, divesting their holdings in companies doing business with South Africa. And many of those companies bowed to the public pressure. IBM and General Motors joined dozens of other American firms in selling out their interests in South Africa. The effect of the pullouts may only be psychological, though, since the operations will continue to run under new South African ownership. President P.W. Botha vowed not to be intimidated.
We are not a nation of weaklings. We do not desire it, and we do not seek it. But if we are forced to go it alone, then so be it.
The white minority government did make a few concessions to its critics over the year. It abolished the pass laws that limited the movements of black South Africans, and it relaxed restrictions on black nationalist leader Winnie Mandela. For the first time in more than 20 years, she was allowed to return to her home in Soweto. But her husband, Nelson Mandela, remains in prison, despite international appeals for his release. The appeals continued throughout the year. And so did the anti-apartheid demonstrations. Reminders to the South African government that the whole world is watching. For the Year in Review, I'm Chuck Roberts.
When the Year in Review continues, East-West relations ice over in Reykjavik.
And the splendor of a royal wedding captivates, thrills, and impresses. On New Year's Day 1986, President Reagan sent a televised message to the people of the Soviet Union. He told them he was looking forward to a visit later in the year from Soviet leader Gorbachev. It will be 1987 when President Reagan returns to the White House from his holiday vacation, and Mr. Gorbachev has yet to come to Washington.
Washington and Moscow spent much of the year in a propaganda war about when to hold a summit and what to talk about. President Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev finally agreed on a preliminary October meeting in Reykjavik, Iceland. But instead of merely agreeing on an agenda, the two leaders opened intense and detailed negotiations on arms control. After about a day, they appeared on the verge of an unexpected and historic agreement on reducing offensive nuclear weapons. Then suddenly it all collapsed. Gorbachev vehemently objected to Reagan's space defense program, Star Wars. Reagan, as strongly, refused to put any limits on Star Wars testing and development. Reagan and Gorbachev parted coolly, each accusing the other of wrecking the negotiations. The surprise summit and its disappointing end followed a superpower dispute about spies. In August, a Soviet UN staff member, Gennady Zakharov, was arrested in New York and accused of buying U.S. defense secrets. In what was seen as retaliation, the the Soviets arrested U.S. newsman Nicholas Danilov in Moscow and accused him of spying. The arrests upset efforts to set a date for the planned summit to be held in the United States. But Washington and Moscow worked out a deal. The Soviets released Danilov after about a month, and the U.S. freed Zakharov in what the White House insisted was not a swap. As part of that deal, Moscow also freed dissident scientist Yuri Orlov, who left with his wife to live in the United States. The new Soviet regime apparently was responding to increasing pressure for human rights. Earlier in the year, Moscow released Anatoly Sharansky, a leader of Jewish protest against Soviet oppression. And late in the year, dissident Nobel Prize winner Andrei Sakharov was allowed to return from exile to a teaching post in Moscow. But after Iceland, superpower relations remained in the deep freeze with no new summit date in sight. The agreements made and then abandoned in Iceland left arms control progress in doubt and the rest of the world wondering what had gone wrong. For the Year in Review, I'm Brian Nelson.
They wanted to awaken America to protest against nuclear weapons, so 1,400 activists started out from Los Angeles on the Great Peace March across America. 2 weeks later, the march stalled for lack of funds, lack of support, and lack of planning. Many dropped out, but 400 diehards regrouped and continued their 3,600-mile trek across the country. It took 8 months, but the marchers finally arrived to stage peace rallies and concerts in New York and the nation's capital.
Revolution, death, and dissent changed the leadership of a number of foreign countries this year, but international headlines also included a royal wedding and a globe-trotting pope.
Haiti's president for life is president no more. Jean-Claude Duvalier was forced into exile by a wave of popular discontent. The end of his 28-year rule was greeted with dancing in the streets. But angry mobs hunted down the members of Duvalier's dreaded secret police, the Tonton Macoute. Henri Namphy, the commander of Duvalier's armed forces, formed a coalition to take over.
They said we get a new government, but it's not really a new government. That's the same government we get.
The new Haiti looks much like the old, with protests, strikes, and one of the world's poorest economies. Mozambique mourned the death of its popular Marxist president, Zamora Machel. Machel and several senior officials of his government died when their plane crashed just inside the South African border. Machel's supporters blame South Africa for his death. South Africa denies it. Machel was succeeded by his foreign minister, who is expected to pursue Mozambique's efforts to improve ties with the United States. Sweden's Prime Minister Olof Palme, an ardent advocate of peace and disarmament, was gunned down by an assassin. For weeks afterward, mourners placed flowers on the spot where he was shot. A group with ties to the Baader-Meinhof terrorists claimed responsibility for the assassination, but no suspect was found. Widespread strikes and violent demonstrations plagued the Chilean government for much of the year. There was even an unsuccessful assassination attempt on President Augusto Pinochet. But he survived to celebrate the 13th anniversary of the day he seized power. The government of Pakistan faced a challenge from opposition leader Benazir Bhutto. She is the daughter of a former prime minister who was executed by the current regime. Large crowds greeted Bhutto's return from self-imposed exile in Britain. 4 months later, she was arrested for addressing a public rally. After her release from prison, Bhutto vowed to continue her campaign. Kurt Waldheim's campaign for the Austrian presidency was plagued by charges that he was involved in Nazi atrocities during World War II. His accusers said Waldheim took part in the brutal persecution of Jews and resistance fighters in Yugoslavia. But on the campaign slogan, "A man trusted by the world," the former Secretary General of the United Nations easily won the elections. Waldheim later admitted he was involved in the Nazi crackdown in Yugoslavia as a supply officer. Elie Wiesel, a survivor of Nazi death camps, was awarded the 1986 Nobel Peace Prize. The noted author and human rights activist has devoted his life to making sure that the world never forgets the Holocaust. Among the major accidents around the world this year was a Mexicana Airlines crash in April. All 166 people on board were killed. More than 500 people drowned when an overloaded ferry boat capsized in Bangladesh. Nearly 400 passengers were dead or missing when their Soviet liner collided with a freighter in the Black Sea. A Soviet nuclear submarine sank in the Atlantic near Bermuda after an explosion killed 3 crewmen on board. The rest of the crew was safely evacuated before the submarine went under. U.S. officials said there was no danger of radioactive contamination of the ocean. A chemical spill on the Rhine River has spread like a blot on the European landscape. Some 30 tons of toxic chemicals were accidentally washed into the river.